The Enchanted Wood by Enid Blyton. Chapter 1. How they found the magic wood. There were once 3 children called Jo, Beth and Franny. All their lives they lived in a town, but now their father had a job in the country, so they were all to move as soon as they possibly could. "What fun to be in the country," said Jo. "I shall learn all about animals and birds." "And I shall pick as many flowers as I want to," said Beth. "And I shall have a garden of my own," said Franny. When the day came for the move, all the children were excited. A small van came to their door and 2 men helped their father and mother to pile everything into it. When it was full, the van drove away and the children put on their coats and hats to go with their mother to catch a train to the station. "Now we're off," cried Jo. The country," sang Beth. "We might see fairies there," said Franny. The train whistled and chuffed out of the station. The children pressed their noses to the window and watched the dirty houses and the chimneys race by. How they hated the town! How lovely it would be to be in the clean country, with flowers growing everywhere and birds singing in the hedges. "We might have adventures in the country," said Jo. "There'll be streams and hillsides, big fields and dark woods. Oh, it will be lovely." "You won't have any more adventures in the country than you'll have in the town," said their father. "I dare say you'll find it all very dull." But that's where he was quite wrong. My goodness, the things that happened to those 3 children. They arrived at last at the tiny station where they were to get out. A sleepy-looking porter put their 2 bags on a trolley and said he would bring them along later. Off they all went down the winding country lane, chattering loudly. "I wonder if we've got a garden," said Franny. But before they reached their new home, they were tired out and could not bother to say a word more to each other. Their cottage was 5 miles from the station, and as the children's father could not afford to do anything but walk there, it seemed a very long way indeed. There was no bus to take them, so the tired children dragged their feet along, wishing for a glass of warm milk and a cosy bed. At last they got there, and, dear me, it was worth all the walk, for the cottage was sweet. Roses hung from the walls, red and white and pink, and honeysuckle was all round the front door. It was lovely. The van was at the door and the 2 men were moving all the furniture into the little house. Father helped while Mother went to light the kitchen stove to make them all a hot drink. They were so tired they could do nothing but drink hot milk, eat some toast, tumble into their beds. Jo looked out of the window, but he was too sleepy to see properly. In 1 minute, the 2 girls in their small room were asleep, and Jo too, in his even tinier room. What fun it was to wake up in the morning and see the sun shining in at strange windows. It didn't take Jo, Beth and Franny very long to dress. Then they were out in the little garden, running through the grass that had grown so long, and smelling the roses that grew all around. Mother had cooked eggs for them, and they ate their breakfast hungrily. "It's lovely to be in the country," said Jo, looking out of the window to the faraway hills. "We can grow vegetables in the garden," said Beth. "And there'll be glorious walks all round," said Franny. That day everyone helped to get the little house straight and tidy. Father was going to work the next day. Mother hoped there would be someone to give her washing to do. And then she would make enough money to buy a few hens. That would be lovely. "I shall collect the eggs each morning and evening," said Franny happily. "Let's go out and see what the country roundabout is like," said Jo. "Can you spare us for an hour, Mother?" "Yes, run along," she said. So off the 3 children went, out of the tiny white front gate and into the lane. They explored all round about. They ran across a field where pink clover was full of bees. They paddled in a small brown stream that chattered away to itself under the willow trees in the sunshine. Then they suddenly came to the wood. It was not far from their cottage at the back. It looked quite an ordinary wood, except that the trees were a darker green than usual. A narrow ditch separated the wood from the overgrown lane. "A wood," said Beth in delight. "We shall be able to have picnics here." "It's rather a mysterious sort of wood," said Jo thoughtfully. "Don't you think so, Beth?" "Well, the trees are rather thick, but they seem about the same as any others," she said. "They don't quite," said Franny. "The noise the leaves make is different. Listen." They listened, and Franny was right. The leaves of the trees in the wood did not rustle in quite the same way as other trees nearby did. "It's almost as if they were really talking to one another," said Beth, "whispering secrets, real secrets that we just can't understand." "It's a magic wood," said Franny suddenly. Nobody said anything. They stood and listened. "Wish, wish, wish, wish," said the trees in the wood, and bent towards one another in a friendly way. "There might be fairy folk in there," said Beth. "Shall we jump over the ditch and go in?" "No," said Joe, "we might get lost. Let's find our way around before we go into big woods like this." "Joe, Beth, Franny," suddenly came their mother's voice from the cottage not far off. "It's time for lunch, time for lunch." The children felt hungry all at once. They forgot the strange wood and ran back to their new home. Mother had fresh bread with strawberry jam for them, and they ate a whole loaf between them. Father came in as they were finishing. He had been shopping for Mother in the village 3 miles away, and he was hungry and tired. "We've been exploring everywhere, Father," said Beth, pouring him out a big cup of tea. "We've found a lovely wood," said Joe. "The trees really seem to be talking to one another." "That must be the wood I've heard about this afternoon," said Father. "It has a strange name, children." "What's it called?" asked Joe. "It's called the Enchanted Wood," said their father. "People don't go there if they can help it." It's funny to hear things like this nowadays, and I don't expect there's really anything strange about the wood, but just be careful not to go too far into it in case you get lost. The children looked in excitement at one another. The Enchanted Wood, what a lovely name. And each child secretly thought the same thought: "I shall go and explore the Enchanted Wood as soon as ever I can." Their father set them to work in the overgrown garden once they had finished their meal. Joe had to pull up the tough thistles, and the 2 girls had to weed the untidy vegetable bed. They spoke to one another in joyful voices. "The Enchanted Wood, we knew there was something magical about it." "I guess there were fairies there," said Franny. "We'll do some more exploring as soon as we can," cried Beth. "We'll find out what those whispering trees are saying. We'll know all the secrets of the wood before many weeks are past." And that night at bedtime, all 3 stood at the window, looking out on the dark, whispering wood behind the cottage. What would they find in the Enchanted Wood? Chapter 2. First Visit to the Wood. The 3 children had no chance to visit the Enchanted Wood until the next week, because they had to help their mother and father all they could. There was the garden to get tidy, clothes and kitchen things to be unpacked and put away, and a great deal of cleaning to be done. Sometimes Joe was free and could have gone by himself. Sometimes the girls were sent out for a walk, but Joe was busy. None of them wanted to go without the others, so they had to wait. And then at last their chance came. "You can have your lunch outdoors today," said Mother. "You've worked well, all of you, and you deserve a picnic. I'll cut you some sandwiches and you can take along some nice fresh milk." "We'll go to the wood," whispered Beth to the others, and with excited faces and beating hearts they helped their mother to pack their picnic into a big basket. They set off. There was a small gate at the bottom of their back garden that led into the overgrown lane running by the wood. They unlatched the gate and stood in the lane. They could see the trees in the wood and hear them talking their strange tree talk. "Wish, wish, wish." "I feel as if there are adventures about," said Joe. "Come on, over the ditch we go and into the Enchanted Wood." One by one the children jumped over the narrow ditch. They stood beneath the trees and peered about. Small freckles of sunshine lay here and there on the ground, but not very many, for the trees were so thick. It was dim and green there, and a small bird nearby sang an odd little song over and over again. "It really is magic," said Franny suddenly. "I can feel magic about somewhere, can't you, Beth? Can't you, Joe?" "Yes," said the others, and their eyes shone with excitement. "Come on." They went down a little green path that looked as if it had been made for rabbits, it was so small and narrow. "Don't let's go too far," said Joe. "We'd better wait till we know the paths a bit better before we go deep into the wood. Look about for a place to sit down and have our sandwiches, girls." "I can see some wild strawberries," cried Beth, and she knelt down and pressed back some leaves, showing the others deep red strawberries below. "Let's pick some and have them with our picnic too," said Franny. So they picked hard and soon had enough to make a fine meal. "Let's sit down under the old oak tree over there," said Joe. "It's all soft moss underneath. Would be like sitting on a green velvet cushion." So they sat down and unpacked their sandwiches. Soon they were munching away happily, listening to the dark green leaves overhead saying, "Wisha, wisha," all the time. And it was whilst they were in the middle of their picnic that they saw a very peculiar thing. Franny noticed it first. Not far off was a clear piece of soft grass. As Franny looked at it, she noticed bumps appearing on it. She stared in surprise. The bumps grew. The earth rose up and broke in about 6 places. "Look," said Franny in a low voice, pointing to the piece of grass. "What's happening over there?" All 3 of them watched in silence, and then they saw what it was. 6 big toadstools were growing quickly up from the ground, pushing their way through and rising up steadily. "I've never seen that happen before," said Joe in astonishment. "Shh," said Beth, "don't make a noise. I can hear footsteps." The others listened. Sure enough, they heard the sound of pattering feet and little high voices. "Let's get behind a bush quickly," said Beth suddenly. "Whoever it is that is coming will be frightened if they see us. There's magic happening here and we want to see it." They scrambled up and crept quietly behind a thick bush, taking their basket with them. They hid just in time, for even as Beth settled down and parted the leaves of the bush to peep through, there came a troop of small men with long beards almost reaching the ground. "Elves," whispered Joe. The elves went to the toadstools and sat down on them. They were holding a meeting. One of them had a bag with him, which he put down behind his toadstool. The children could not hear what was being said, but they heard the sound of the chattering voices and caught 1 or 2 words. Suddenly Joe nudged Beth and Franny. He'd seen something else. The girls saw it too. An ugly gnome-like fellow was creeping up silently behind the meeting on the toadstools. None of the elves saw him or heard him. "He's after that bag," whispered Joe, and so he was. He reached out a long arm. His bony fingers closed on the bag. He began to draw it away under a bush. Joe jumped up. He was not going to watch people being robbed without saying something. He shouted loudly, "Stop, thief! Hey, look at that gnome behind you." In a fright, the elves all leapt up. The gnome jumped to his feet and sped off with the bag. The elves stared after him in dismay, not one of them following him. The robber ran towards the children's bush. He didn't know they were there. As quick as lightning, Joe put out his foot and tripped up the running gnome. Down he went, crash. The bag flew from his hand, and Beth picked it up and threw it to the astonished elves, who were still standing by the toadstools. Joe tried to grab the gnome, but he was up and off like a bird. The children tore after him. In between the trees they went, dodging here and there, and at last they saw the gnome leap up onto the low branches of a great tree and pull himself into the leaves. The children sank down at the bottom, out of breath. "We've got him now," said Joe. "He can't get down without being caught." "Here are the elves coming," said Beth, wiping her hot forehead. The little bearded men ran up and bowed. "You are very good to us," said the biggest one. "Thank you for saving our bag. We have valuable papers in there." "We've got the gnome for you too," said Joe as he pointed up into the tree. "He went up there. If you surround the tree and wait, you'll be able to catch him as he comes down." But the elves would not come too near the tree. They looked half frightened of it. "He will not come down until he wants to," said the biggest elf. "That is the oldest and most magic tree in the world. It is the Faraway Tree." "A Faraway Tree," said Beth in wonder. "What an odd name. Why do you call it that?" "It's a very strange tree," said another elf. "Its top reaches the faraway places in a way we don't understand. Sometimes its top branches may be in Witchland. sometimes in lovely countries, sometimes in peculiar places that no one has ever heard of. We never climb it because we never know what might be at the top." "How very strange," said the children. "The gnome has got into whatever place there is at the top of the tree today," said the biggest elf. "He may live there for months and never come down again. It's no good waiting for him, and it's certainly no good going after him. His name is Creepy because he's forever creeping about quietly." The children looked up into the broad leafy boughs of the tree. They felt tremendously excited. The Faraway Tree in the Enchanted Wood. Oh, what magic there seemed to be in the very names. "If only we could climb up," said Joe longingly. "You must never do that," said the elves at once. "It's dangerous. We must go now, but we do thank you for your help. If ever you want us to help you, just come into the Enchanted Wood and whistle 7 times under the oak tree not far from our toadstools." "Thank you," said the children, and stared after the 6 small elves as they ran off between the trees. Joe thought it was time to go home, so they followed the little men down the narrow green path until they came to the part of the wood they knew. They picked up their basket and went home, all of them thinking the same thought. We must go up the Faraway Tree and see what is at the top. Chapter 3. Up the Faraway Tree. The children did not tell their father and mother about the happenings in the Enchanted Wood, for they were so afraid that they might be forbidden to go there. But when they were alone, they talked about nothing else. "When do you suppose we could go up the Faraway Tree?" Franny kept asking. "Oh, do let's go, Joe." Joe wanted to go very badly, but he was a little afraid of what might happen, and he knew that he ought to look after his 2 sisters and see that no harm came to them. Just suppose they all went up the Faraway Tree and never came back. Then he had an idea. "Listen," he said, "I know what we'll do. We'll climb up the tree and just see what is at the top. We don't need to go there, we can just look. We'll wait until we have a whole day to ourselves, then we'll go." The girls were so excited. They worked hard in the house, hoping that their mother would say they could have the whole day to themselves. Joe worked hard in the garden too, clearing away all the weeds, and their parents were very pleased. "Would you like to go to the nearest town and have a day there?" asked Mother at last. No, thank you," said Joe at once. "We've had enough of towns, Mother. What we'd really like is to go and have a whole day picnic in the wood." "Very well," said Mother, "you can go tomorrow. Father is going off for the day to buy some things we need, and I have things to do here in the cottage. So as I'll be close by, you can take your lunch and dinner and go off by yourselves if it's fine and sunny." The children hoped the day would be fine. They woke early and jumped out of bed, pulled the curtains open and looked out, and the sky was as blue as cornflowers. The sun shone between the trees and the shadows lay long and dewy on the grass. The Enchanted Wood stood dark and mysterious behind their garden. They all had breakfast, then Mother cut sandwiches and put them in a bag along with 3 cakes each. She sent Joe to pick some plums from the garden and told Beth to take 2 bottles of lemonade. The children were most excited. Father set off to town and the children waved goodbye to him from the gate. Then they tore off indoors to get the bag in which their food had been put. They said goodbye to their mother and slammed the cottage door. Adventures were in the air that morning. "Up the Faraway Tree, Joe, Beth and me," sang Franny loudly. "Hush," said Joe. "We're not far from the Enchanted Wood. We don't want anyone to know what we're going to do." They ran down the back garden and out the little gate at the end. They stood still in the overgrown narrow lane and looked at one another. It was the first big adventure of their lives. What were they going to see? What were they going to do? They jumped over the ditch and into the wood. At once they felt different. Magic was all around them. The birds' song sounded different. The trees once again whispered secretly to one another. "Wish, wish, wish." "Ooh," said Franny, shivering with delight. "Come on," said Joe, going down the green path. "Let's find the Faraway Tree." They followed him. He went on until he came to the oak tree under which they had sat before. There were the 6 toadstools too, on which the elves had held their meeting, though the toadstools looked rather brown and old now. "Which is the way now?" said Beth, stopping. None of them knew. They set off down a little path, but they soon stopped, for they came to a strange place where the trees stood so close together that they could go no farther. They went back to the oak tree. "Let's go this other way," said Beth, so they set off in a different direction. But this time they came to a curious pond, whose waters were pale yellow and shone like butter. Beth didn't like the look of the pond at all, and the 3 of them went back once more to the oak tree. "This is too bad," said Franny, almost crying. "Just when we've got a whole day to ourselves, we can't find the tree." "I'll tell you what we'll do," said Joe suddenly. "We'll call those elves. Don't you remember how they said they'd help us whenever we wanted them?" "Of course," said Franny. "We had to stand under this oak tree and whistle 7 times. "Go on, Joe, whistle," said Beth. So Joe stood beneath the thick green leaves of the old oak tree and whistled loudly 7 times. The children waited. In about half a minute, a rabbit popped its head out of a nearby rabbit hole and stared at them. "What do you want?" said the rabbit in a furry sort of voice. The children stared in surprise. They'd never heard an animal speak before. The rabbit put its ears up and down and spoke again rather crossly. "Are you deaf? What do you want?" I said. "We want one of the elves," said Joe, finding his tongue at last. The rabbit turned and called down his hole. Mr. Whiskers, there's someone wanting you." There came a voice shouting something in answer, and then one of the 6 elves squeezed out of the rabbit hole and stared at the children. "Sorry to be so long," he said. "One of the rabbit's children has the measles, and I was down there seeing to it." "I didn't think rabbits got the measles," said Beth, astonished. "They more often get the weasels," said Mr. Whiskers. "Weasels are even more catching than measles as far as rabbits are concerned." He grinned as if he'd made a huge joke, but as the children had no idea that weasels were savage little animals that caught rabbits, they didn't laugh. "We wanted to ask you the way to the Faraway Tree," said Beth. "We've forgotten it." "I'll take you," said Mr. Whiskers, whose name was really a very good one, for his beard reached his toes. Sometimes he trod on it, and this jerked his head downwards suddenly. Beth kept wanting to laugh, but she thought she'd better not. She wondered why he didn't tie it round his waist out of the way of his feet. Mr. Whiskers led the way between the dark trees. At last he reached the trunk of the enormous Faraway Tree. "Here you are," he said. "Are you expecting someone down it today?" "Well, no," said Joe. "We rather wanted to go up by ourselves." "Go up by yourselves?" said Mr. Whiskers in horror. "Don't be silly, it's dangerous. You don't know what might be at the top. There's a different place almost every day." "Well, we're going," said Joe firmly, and he set his foot against the trunk of the tremendous tree and took hold of a branch above his head. "Come on, girls." "I shall fetch my brothers and get you down," said Mr. Whiskers in a fright, and he scuttled off crying, "It's so dangerous, it's so dangerous." "Do you suppose it is all right to go?" asked Beth, who was usually the sensible one. "Come on, Beth," said Joe impatiently. "We're only going to see what's at the top. Don't be a baby." "I'm not," said Beth, and she and Franny hauled themselves up beside Joe. "It doesn't look very difficult to climb. We'll soon be at the top." But it wasn't as easy as they thought, and you will see. Chapter 4. The Folk in the Faraway Tree. Before very long the children were hidden in the branches as they climbed upwards. When Mr. Whiskers came back with 5 other elves, not a child could be seen. "Hey, come down," yelled the elves, dancing around the tree. "You'll be captured or lost. This tree is dangerous." Joe laughed and peered down. The Faraway Tree seemed to be growing acorns just where he was, so he picked one and threw it down. It hit Mr. Whiskers on the hat, and he rushed away shouting, "Oh, something's hit me, something's hit me." Then there was silence. "They've gone," said Joe, laughing again. "I expect they don't much like it when it rains acorns, funny little things. Come on, girls." "This must be an oak tree if it grows acorns," said Beth as she climbed. But just as she said that, she stared in surprise at something nearby. It was a prickly chestnut case with hard nuts inside. "Good gracious," she said, "is growing horse chestnuts just here? What a very peculiar tree." "Well, let's hope it will grow apples and pears high up," said Franny with a giggle. "It's a most extraordinary tree." Soon they were quite high up. When Joe parted the leaves and tried to see out of the tree, he was amazed to find that he was far higher than the tallest tree in the wood. He and the girls looked down on the top of all the other trees, which looked like a broad green carpet below. Joe was higher up than the girls. Suddenly he gave a shout. "I say, girls, come up here by me quickly. I've found something odd." Beth and Franny climbed quickly up. "Why, it's a window in the tree," said Beth in astonishment. They all peered inside, and suddenly the window was flung open and an angry little face looked out with a nightcap on. "Rude creatures," shouted the angry little man who looked like a pixie. "Everybody that climbs that tree pops in and peeps at me. Doesn't matter what I'm doing, there's always someone peeping." The children were too astonished to do anything but stare. The pixie disappeared and came back with a jug of water. He flung it at Beth and soaked her. She gave a scream. "Perhaps you won't peep into other people's houses next time," said the pixie with a grin, and he slammed his window shut again and drew the curtain. "Well," said Beth, trying to wipe herself dry with her handkerchief, "what a rude little man." "We'd better not look in at any windows we pass," said Joe, "but I was so surprised to see a window in the tree." Beth soon got dry. They climbed up again and soon had another surprise. They came to a broad branch that led to a yellow door set neatly in the big trunk of the Faraway Tree. It had a little door knocker and a brightly polished bell. The children stared at the door. "I wonder who lives there," said Franny. "Shall we knock and see?" said Joe. "Well, I don't want water all over me again," said Beth. "We'll ring the bell and then hide behind this branch," said Joe. "If anyone thinks he's going to throw water at us, he won't find us." So Joe rang the bell, and then they all hid carefully behind a big branch. A voice came from the inside of the door. "I'm washing my hair. If that's the butcher, please leave a pound of sausages." The children stared at one another and laughed. It was odd to hear of butchers coming up the Faraway Tree. The voice shouted again, "If it's the oil man, I don't want anything. If it's the red dragon, he must call again next week." "Good gracious," said Beth, looking rather frightened. "The red dragon. I don't like the sound of that." At that moment the yellow door opened and a small fairy looked out. Her hair was fluffed around her shoulders, drying, and she was rubbing it with a towel. She stared at the peeping children. "Did you ring my bell?" she asked. "What do you want?" "We just wanted to see who lived in the funny little tree house," said Joe, peering in at the dark room inside the tree. The fairy smiled. She had a very sweet face. "Come in for a moment," she said. "My name is Silky because of my silky hair. Where are you off to?" "We're climbing the Faraway Tree to see what is at the top," said Joe. "Be careful you don't find something horrid," said Silky, giving them each a chair in her dark little tree room. "Sometimes there are delightful places at the top of the tree, but sometimes there are strange lands too. Last week there was the land of Hippity Hop, which was dreadful. As soon as you got there you had to hop on one leg, and everything went hippity hop, even the trees. Nothing ever kept still. It was most tiring." "Does sound exciting," said Beth. "Where's our food, Joe? Let's ask Silky to have some." Silky was pleased. She sat there brushing her beautiful golden hair and ate sandwiches with them. She brought out a tin of pop cakes, which were lovely. As soon as you bit into them, they went pop, and you suddenly found your mouth filled with new honey from the middle of the little cakes. Franny took 7, one after another, for she was rather greedy, and Beth stopped her. "You'll go pop if you eat any more," she said. "Do a lot of people live in this tree?" asked Joe. "Yes, lots," said Silky. "They move in and out, you know, but I'm always here, and so is the angry pixie down below." Yes, we've seen him," said Beth. "Who else is there?" "There's a Mr. What's-his-name above me," said Silky. "Nobody knows his name and he doesn't know it himself, so he's called Mr. What's-his-name. Don't wake him if he's asleep, he might chase you. Then there's Dame Wash-a-Lot, she's always washing, and as she pours her water away down the tree, you've got to look out for waterfalls." "This is such an interesting and exciting tree," said Beth, finishing her cake. "Joe, I think we ought to go now or we'll never get to the top. Goodbye, Silky, we'll come and see you again one day." "Do," said Silky, "I'd like to be friends." They all left the dear little round room in the tree and began to climb once more. Not long after, they heard a peculiar noise. It sounded like an aeroplane throbbing and roaring. "But there can't be an aeroplane in this tree," said Joe. He peered all round, and then he saw what was making the noise. A funny old gnome sat in a deck chair on a broad branch, his mouth wide open, his eyes fast shut, snoring hard. "It's Mr. What's-his-name," said Beth. "What a noise he makes. Mind we don't wake him." "Shall I put a cherry in his mouth and see what happens?" asked Joe, who was always ready for a bit of mischief. The Faraway Tree was now growing cherries all around for a change, and there were plenty to pick. "No, Joe, no," said Beth. "You know what Silky said. He might chase us. I don't want to fall out of the Faraway Tree and bump down from bough to bough, even if you do." So they all crept past old Mr. What's-his-name and went on climbing, up and up. For a long time nothing happened, except that the wind blew in the tree. The children did not pass any more houses or windows in the tree, and then they heard another noise, rather a peculiar one. They listened. It sounded like a waterfall, and suddenly Joe guessed what it was. "It's Dame Wash-a-Lot throwing out her dirty water," he yelled. "Look out, Beth! Look out, Franny!" Down the trunk of the tree poured a lot of blue soapy water. Joe dodged it. Franny slipped under a broad branch, but poor old Beth got splashed from head to foot. How she shouted. Joe and Franny had to lend her their handkerchiefs. "I'm so unlucky," sighed Beth. "That's twice I've been soaked today." Up they went again, passing more little doors and windows, but seeing no one else, and at last they saw above them a vast white cloud. "Look," said Joe in amazement. "This cloud has a hole in it, and the branches go up, and I believe we're at the very top of the tree. Shall we creep through the cloud hole and see what land is above?" "Let's," cried Beth and Franny, so up they went.